So initially I was going to try to get through this in about half an hour and open this up so that we could all talk about it. And the more I got into this, the more material made it into the presentation. I'm actually going to be rushing just to get done at all, which is unfortunate because I think the most important part of this would be a group conversation. So I'm willing to stay after for as long as other people want to, or we've got a survey that asks if you want to be involved in continuing discussions. So this is not the last word. This is hopefully just something that kicks off a longer conversation. So I wanted to start with a land acknowledgement that I am on stolen Duwamish and Coast Salish land. And I think that's especially important in this case because with hydrogen, it tends to be abstract conversations about things like the emissions of various technologies or decarbonization strategies. And it's really important to remember that any decisions that we make have real world consequences for frontline communities. And because we're talking about the fossil fuel industry, a lot of that is to indigenous communities, whether or not we build new pipelines or whether gas power plants stay in operation. So I think it's really important, even though we're going to be talking in kind of abstract terms about what the right thing to do is from a climate standpoint, I really want us to stay grounded in the fact that we're talking about all of this on stolen land. So let me jump right into it. Start sharing slides. And so I want to start by looking at where emissions come from. So this is a breakdown of, one other thing I wanted to say also, even though we're going to probably not have much time at all for conversation, I do encourage people to put questions in the chat. I'll try to respond after the presentation because there are some big open questions still. And I want to make sure that people are getting answers to those. So this is the way that this is a breakdown of emissions from energy. And this doesn't include agriculture. That's a whole separate topic. That's really the other half of the puzzle. But half of what we've got to do is figure out how to stop emitting greenhouse gases. And this is one way to look at the sources of those, one way to break that down. And it may be a little bit different than you're used to seeing. We typically see transportation pretty high, residential and commercial pretty high. And that's because we're usually looking at Seattle or Washington emissions. But globally, industry is actually a lot more, and electricity is the biggest. And the reason that I think it helps to look at these is because all of them have an aspect that is considered difficult to decarbonize. And so I think this is kind of a useful way to look at it. And the reason that we're talking about hydrogen and things that are difficult to decarbonize is because since 350 Seattle was formed, our mission was really, we need to wake people up to the fact that there's a climate crisis. And we need to just make people aware that we need to keep fossil fuels in the ground. Fairly simple message. And what's happened is that is finally starting to take hold, and the media is acknowledging there's a crisis, and people are having serious conversations about, okay, how do we really clean this up? And that often ends in talk about these areas that are more difficult to solve. And this is relevant for hydrogen because that's often used as one of the options for decarbonizing these more difficult areas. And so if you look at each one of them, electricity is easy up to maybe 80%. You just keep adding more renewables. And after 80%, it gets difficult because you need storage at that point, and you have peaks that are difficult to deal with. So the last 80% is pretty tough. Industry, a lot of manufacturing can be electrified, and electrification is what makes something easy in general. Everything on the left side of this, the reason it's easy is because it can be run with electricity. And the reason that's a fairly easy solution from a technical standpoint is because we know that we can clean up electricity, and it's extremely efficient. Most of the energy that goes into creating electricity is used by the appliance or whatever. You don't have a lot of waste, and so when you're trying to decarbonize something, your first option is, if you can electrify it, you do that. So for industry, you can do a lot of that, but you can't do that for cement, steel, and ammonia, and a couple other little ones, but those are the big ones. And it doesn't seem like that big of a deal because it's just a couple of different materials, but this stuff is everywhere. And these three by themselves represent 10% of global emissions. So that's a pretty serious problem that we've got to solve, and electrification just doesn't work for that. Transportation, electricity works for a lot of it. Passenger cars, obviously, you can convert to EVs, and you can go up to trucks, light trucks. We probably go farther than we've gone so far. I think we can electrify some pretty heavy vehicles, but you do run into limits. And so you can't use electricity to get a cargo ship across the ocean, because you would need so many batteries that you wouldn't have room for cargo. And for aviation, it's kind of a non-starter also. You can't use batteries to get a plane that holds a couple of hundred people across the country, because you'd need so many batteries it wouldn't get off the ground. And so that's why that's considered a difficult problem, is because electrification just doesn't work at that scale. And residential and commercial, it's all easy. And obviously that doesn't mean easy from a political standpoint. It's going to take a lot of work to do that, but very easy from a technical standpoint. We're talking about natural gas use for heating, cooking, natural gas dryers. There are electric alternatives for all of those, and that's what we should do. And so that doesn't actually have anything that falls into the difficult category. So I think to understand whether or not hydrogen is the right thing to use, we should look at what the alternatives are for each one of these. So aviation and shipping are the ones that people often go to when they're talking about tough to solve problems, because this is pretty understandable that if you can't get the plane off the ground, that's not going to work. So what do you do? And it really comes down to hydrogen or biofuels. And you might hear about other alternatives like ammonia or methanol. Those are really just variations of hydrogen. You start with hydrogen and you mix it with either nitrogen or carbon dioxide. But to start with, you have to generate hydrogen in the same way you would if you're using the hydrogen directly in a fuel cell. So it comes down to, do you manufacture hydrogen or do you use biofuels? And I have a lot of concerns about biofuels. It actually starts out pretty good. There is this program that 350 Seattle is signed on to, which collects cooking oil from restaurants and turns that into biodiesel for transportation. And I think that's a great application, because this is stuff that would have gone to waste, and instead we're using it to displace fossil fuels. But the more you push on biofuels, the worse it gets. And so the next thing you would do is you would take maybe everybody's lawn clippings, and that's fine. Or you would take agricultural residue. So when you harvest corn, you've got a bunch of stalks and leaves left over, turn that into biofuels, that's fine. But then you keep pushing and you get into other things, because there's just not much of all of this to support even all of aviation and shipping, much less everything else. So you keep pushing, and then you start generating biofuels from things that are more problematic because of the incentives they create. So for example, you start taking methane from dairy farms, and that's fine because it would have gone to the atmosphere anyway. But the problem is then you're creating an incentive to start centralizing farms and making big concentrated feedlots. So we don't really want to do that, and it keeps getting worse. If you keep pushing, then you end up creating enough pressure that industry starts cutting down the rainforest and replacing it with soy and palm plantations, or they start cutting into the arboreal forest to create wood chips. And so you really don't want to push biofuels too far. They work great up to a certain point, and then the trade-offs become, to me, unacceptable, especially because that goes counter to what we really need to be doing with land, which is rewilding it and reforesting. And this is putting pressure to turn land into energy crops. So I don't think biofuels is the solution for all of these. I just don't think there's enough of it. And for some things, you don't have another option. For ammonia, it's made with hydrogen. That's what they do now. You don't have any other alternatives. Looking at cement and steel, the reason they're so bad is because part of the emissions comes from the combustion. You have to get really hot temperatures. And right now they use fossil fuels for that. And the other thing is just the reaction itself. With steel, you mix coal and iron, and so that produces carbon dioxide just as a byproduct of the chemical reaction. And the same thing with cement. You start with limestone that has carbon in it, just the chemical reaction. One of the byproducts is carbon dioxide. So both of them generate a lot of CO2. And so for the heat, it again comes down to hydrogen or biomass. For the reaction, steel, you can use hydrogen. Instead of using coal, you can use hydrogen instead. That's really the only other alternative you have. For cement, there is no alternative, unfortunately. There is no chemical process that they know of that would create cement without carbon dioxide. So they talk about things like capturing the carbon, which I don't know if they're going to be able to get all of it, or just using alternative materials. And one of the things they talk about a lot is cross-laminated timber, but that's timber. That's another form of biomass. So a lot of this really comes down to, do you go hydrogen or do you start cutting down trees? 100% electricity is really a different thing. Everything else is a problem because you need energy density that you can't get with anything other than biofuels and hydrogen. 100% electricity is hard because of the intermittency of renewables, which is a totally different problem. And people talk about hydrogen a little bit, maybe for seasonal storage. I don't think it's going to be a great option for that. I think there are better things you can do. With batteries, it doesn't have to be lithium ion. You can, because you don't have space or weight constraints, you can use all kinds of really creative batteries, and I think that's going to be a better option, even though we haven't quite figured out what those are going to be yet. Or you interconnect the grids. So in Washington, we would connect with California and Montana, and that way, if we have a period of time where we've got gray skies over the whole state and we don't have a lot of wind, then we get wind power from Montana. And when they don't have a lot of wind, we let them use some of our hydropower. So the more you interconnect the grids, the less need you have for storage. So that's kind of the landscape of these difficult to decarbonize problems. And most of them, like I said, come down to hydrofuels or biofuels or hydrogen. And so, you know what I think about biofuels. So, so let's talk about whether hydrogen is a reasonable alternative. And oh, actually, let me say this one thing first. Hopefully this is showing. I've got something covering the bottom of my screen, but it should be saying use less at the bottom. And that is the first thing that we do. That's before trying to do something to replace this energy. We need to have serious conversations about degrowth and about limiting our consumption. Because all of these things have trade-offs, and if you're not using the energy in the first place, you're much better off. And that even applies to the easy to decarbonize sectors. EVs, yes, a solvable problem, but the better thing to do, instead of building a whole lot of batteries, is to have fewer cars and more public transport. So everywhere, use less is the first thing that you try to do. And in these difficult sectors, that can have a lot of benefits. So for ammonia, that's fertilizer that we use. We use a lot of it for agriculture. But if we were to do regenerative agriculture, you don't need nearly as much fertilizer. So you really cut back on that. And then because of that, you cut back on the need to ship fertilizer. And I try to calculate this, and what I got was that at any moment in time, there are about 40 ships in the ocean that are transporting ammonia because everybody uses fertilizer. And so if you really cut down on the amount of fertilizer that's being used with better farming practices, then you have a lot less shipping. And so you don't have those emissions. And if you need fewer ships, then you don't need as much steel to build these ships. So use less ends up really rippling through all of this and should be the first thing we try to do. But if we can't do that and we have to use hydrogen, let's look at how clean it is. And it turns out it's very clean. Green hydrogen is extremely clean, and green really means something. I'm not just calling it green. It's sort of like organic, where it has a legal definition. If something is green hydrogen, that means it comes from renewables. And you use renewables to create electricity. You run that electricity through water. It splits the water into hydrogen and oxygen. No greenhouse emissions. And when you take that hydrogen and try to use that for energy, if you use it in a fuel cell, you recombine it with oxygen, again, no emissions. Extremely clean process all the way around. And the reason that may not sound right is because we've heard about how dirty hydrogen is. And we've, and in the notes that for this meeting, when we were describing it, we talked about how there's this study showing it's as bad as coal. And it's because this is not the way they make it right now. What they make is not green hydrogen, they make gray hydrogen. And this is primarily for ammonia fertilizer, and also the fossil fuel industry uses a lot of hydrogen for other reasons. And what they do is they take natural gas, methane, and they hit it with high pressure, high temperature steam. And that creates hydrogen. It also creates carbon dioxide as a byproduct, and that just goes in the atmosphere. Really dirty process. But this is what they do. And that's why you hear about hydrogen being so awful, because this process really is. So you might think, okay, well, that's fine. This is an easy problem to solve. We just do green instead. We outlaw this gray hydrogen, and we just start building up green hydrogen, and we use that for all of these hard to solve problems. And the problem with that is that green hydrogen takes a lot of energy. I was saying that electricity is really efficient. Green hydrogen is not. So say you build a new wind farm, and you've got enough, it produces enough electricity that you can create enough green hydrogen to run 1 million cars through a fuel cell. So you've got a bunch of fuel cell cars being powered with this. You can run 1 million of them. If you took that same wind farm and connected it to the grid instead, you could power 3 million cars. And so what that means is any renewables that we're adding, if we add them to the grid, we're displacing 3 times as many fossil fuels as if we're using them to make hydrogen. So until we get the grid cleaned up, that's what we need to be concentrating on. It doesn't make sense to generate a lot of green hydrogen because you could more effectively use that energy to displace coal from the utility grid. But I think that there are ways that we can build the grid that set us up for green hydrogen. And so to show how that works, I'm going to go through an example where we are in charge of trying to come up with a green energy strategy for Washington. And so we start out with, to make things simple, we've got half hydropower and half fossil fuels. And we're told, okay, clean this up using just solar power and batteries, which sounds really difficult because people talk about solar not working that well because obviously it's not working all night. So how do you do that? And the first thing we would do is build a bunch of solar power up to the point where at peak output, that's supplying all the electricity we need. And I should explain this squiggly line on top. So that is the electricity demand. It goes down at night. Then in the morning, people wake up, they're turning on lights and appliances. It's different for different seasons, but this time of year, this is kind of what it looks like, where it's fairly flat during the day, goes up a little bit in the evenings, and then back down at night. So that's what we need to provide electricity for. That's what we need to match. And so we're going to start with solar and just see where that gets us. So we're going to put in as many solar panels as it takes so that at max output, they're supplying everything we need. And we don't want to go beyond that, because anything beyond that is wasted. If you are generating more solar power than the grid can handle, you have to just throw that away. You have to just turn the solar panels off. And we're trying to do this with the least cost. And so we don't want to be buying solar panels and then not using them. So that's what we start with. And the first thing you notice is that your hydropower goes a lot farther. And this is not me just drawing lines and saying, I bet this would be higher. I actually carefully measured all of this to see if this was really what would happen. And the area in blue on the left is the exact same as the area on the right. This is what would happen to hydropower. Because obviously during the day, you're getting everything from solar. You can save your hydro for overnight. And this is part of why when people say solar power doesn't really get you anything, because what are you going to do if you want to watch TV at night? That's not really true, because the solar power you get during the day displaces other forms of renewables that you can use at night. So that gets us a little bit of the way there. We're kind of close, but we still need more batteries. But you can't just add batteries because we don't have any way to power them. So you actually do need more solar power than this, because you need excess to be able to charge the batteries. So when you do that, it looks like this. So now we've got enough solar power to charge the batteries, and this looks like the optimum solution. Nothing's going to waste. At night, you start generating, well, at night you're using batteries, and you have depleted the batteries just at the time the sun comes up and takes over. In the middle of the day, you've got so much solar power, it takes care of everything, and you've even got extra to charge out the batteries. As the sun's going down, your batteries are fully charged. They take over for the rest of the night. So you've got just the right amount of storage, just the right amount of storage of solar, and we feel like we've solved the problem. But there was a study done about 3 years ago, and studies since then have corroborated that. And what that said was, this is actually not the optimum solution. What you want to do is massively overbuild renewables, even though that seems wasteful, even though you're going to throw some of it away, because storage is really the expensive piece. You want to do everything you can to minimize storage. And renewables are really cheap. Solar power has come down. It costs 1/10 what it cost 10 years ago, and it's still coming down really fast. And the same thing for wind, that's dropped. Batteries have dropped too, but not as much, and there's reason to think they've kind of plateaued. So storage is likely always going to be the sticking point, and you want to minimize that. So to do that, you overbuild your renewables. And so in this case, I increased the solar output by 50%. And this is what it did to storage. And again, this isn't me just drawing a line and saying there would be less storage. This is exactly what would happen. If you increase storage, at least in this case, it differs depending on how close you are to the line. But in this case, with this much storage to start with, you cut it down, in this case, by half. So by increasing solar output by 50%, I reduced the amount of storage necessary. I cut it in half. And so from a cost standpoint, this is a much better solution. And the longer we go, the more renewable prices come down, the more true that becomes. And the really cool thing about this is this was the optimum solution anyway, just to supply electricity to the grid. And that solution resulted in a lot of wasted power at peak output. But it doesn't have to be wasted, because you can use that surplus power to create green hydrogen, and you're effectively getting that for free, because that was you already had spare capacity just in solving the electricity problem. So I think this is one way the future could look. On the left, you've got the current electricity production, and globally, most of it's fossil fuels, like 90%. And so we build up enough renewables to take care of all of that, and we just keep building. Probably, I don't know what it would be, but maybe at least twice what we need to supply electricity now. And everything that can be electrified is, because that's really efficient. That just goes straight to whatever application you're using it for. And then anything that can't, you take that same renewable electricity, you split water, you run it in a fuel cell, and then that solves the rest of the problems. So that probably all sounded great. And I do have, I'm very optimistic that this is a workable way of solving these difficult problems. But it's really important to talk about the risks too. One of them is, because there is going to be this delay, because what I'm suggesting is it doesn't really make sense to be building up green hydrogen right now. We should be cleaning up the grid first. That means that these other sectors may buy into these suboptimal solutions like natural gas or LNG, liquefied natural gas. And they may say, well, we're being told to clean up right now and we don't have green hydrogen, so we're going to go with LNG because that seems like a good half step. And that's disastrous. We need everything to be using purely clean alternatives. So one risk is just that delay will cause industry to make the wrong decision. And the other risk is more intentional, which is the natural gas industry recognizing that delay is something that they can take advantage of, and recognizing there's a lot of confusion about hydrogen because this is all brand new, and using this to continue their industry. And I think there are two ways they're going to do that. One is by talking about blending hydrogen with natural gas. And when they're talking about doing that in residential or commercial areas, they shouldn't be talking about that anyway, because the solution is electrification. And I do want to make one distinction here. I think any talk about putting hydrogen into the pipelines for consumer use is the wrong thing to do. There is talk also about using pipelines for hydrogen transport from generation facilities like large solar arrays to the end use application. So to the shipping yards or to the industrial sites. So you might need hydrogen or pipelines to transport the hydrogen in that case, and you might be able to reuse natural gas pipelines. The jury's still out on that. But that might be possible, and that might be the most effective way to do it. And so I wouldn't say that any talk about putting hydrogen in pipelines is necessarily wrong, but if they're talking about putting it in the pipelines that come to us, to our homes, to our schools, to our businesses, that's the wrong thing to do. And the reason they would want to do that is to try to convince legislators that they're using hydrogen to clean up methane. We've seen that before with renewable natural gas, where what they say is, we're putting this carbon neutral fuel into the pipelines. We're cleaning up what was already fairly clean. And legislators who don't know a lot may hear, okay, well, I have heard before that natural gas is clean, and they're saying they're doing all these things to make it even cleaner. That is pure greenwashing, because not only is the wrong thing to do to put hydrogen into the pipelines anyway, because it doesn't have use in the commercial or private sector, or commercial or public sector, but also they can only go so far with this. When they get beyond about 20% hydrogen mixture, the burners on the stoves and furnaces have to be replaced. And that is ridiculous to spend money to replace the burners when what we want to be doing is spending money to replace them with electric. So that would be a terrible decision if they started adding hydrogen to reduce the carbon intensity of the fuel. Legislators went along with that and then somehow convinced them that we need to be upgrading the burners to support even more hydrogen. That's taking steps towards the wrong solution. So that's one aspect of greenwashing. The other one is something called blue hydrogen. Very, very serious risk, because in that case, it's similar to the way natural gas was peddled as a bridge fuel for electricity. They want to use the same concept for hydrogen. They want to use blue hydrogen as a bridge between what we have right now, the gray hydrogen, and green hydrogen, which everybody agrees is the ultimate right solution. So blue hydrogen is when they take gray hydrogen and they capture the CO2 and sequester it. And so that sounds like they cleaned it up, because it was the CO2 that was getting in the atmosphere that was the problem with gray hydrogen. This is what the study just looked at. This is brand new information. They looked at this very carefully and concluded this actually doesn't save you anything. This is still just as bad as coal. And the reason is it doesn't capture all the CO2 for one. The best they could probably do is 80%, and they probably can't even get that. And the methane that leaks during this process, methane's a much stronger greenhouse gas. It leaks during the transport to the location where it's being manufactured. It leaks at extraction from the fracking. Also, the steam that was superheated and then placed under pressure, that heat comes from burning natural gas, and the pressure, the energy for the pressure comes from natural gas. And the energy for the carbon capture, which is very energy intensive, that comes from natural gas too. So when you add all of these things, it still has as many emissions as any other fossil fuel. So when they say this could be a bridge, you're not saving yourself anything by capturing the carbon. And we know they're going to do this because they're already doing this. This is an advertisement from Alberta where they're using the shale found near the tar sands, and they're advertising that this blue hydrogen produces nearly zero emissions. So that's the story they're going to tell, is that the problem was the CO2 and we're capturing that, so we fixed it. And it's not ideal, but we fixed it enough to get us by until we have green hydrogen. And so obviously that's false, but I think there's another argument that could be made by somebody who is well-informed and well-intentioned, which would be, okay, I acknowledge blue hydrogen is just as bad as any other fossil fuel, but we don't have green hydrogen yet. And we don't want to get stuck in a chicken and egg situation where in 10 years we want to transition to green hydrogen and we haven't done any of the work necessary to get there. We haven't done the ship conversions to fuel cells. We don't have any transport for it. We're not ready to start. And it's because we didn't have any transition. And so this reasonable person might say, let's just use blue hydrogen for now. I acknowledge it is polluting, but it does build us the infrastructure that we need. And here would be my arguments against that. I personally think that would be a terrible idea. And for one thing, that would really drive up natural gas consumption because it's less efficient. And if we look at this, so for shipping, it already takes 3 times as much as it would to electrify a car because you're going through this energy intensive process. And so you've used a lot more methane just because it's an inefficient process, but also all of the everything that went into the manufacture of this uses natural gas. Like I was saying around emissions, the steam, the pressure, the carbon capture, it's all natural gas. So the amount of natural gas extraction would go way up. And that means in North America, you're talking about fracking going way up. So if we were to use blue hydrogen as a bridge fuel, then the for the next 10 years, we would accelerate fracking. And we know what goes with that. Increased air pollution, water pollution, man camps, missing and murdered Indigenous women, all of that increases if we buy into this idea of blue hydrogen as a transition fuel. And another thing that this would cause is another form of lock-in. Because if industry invests in all of this capacity for carbon capture and for everything else that goes along with it, they're not going to invest that for 10 years and then throw it all away. They invest in these projects because they expect a 30-year life cycle, and it's only profitable if it runs for that long. So if they said, we're going to invest all this money in blue hydrogen, and then in 10 years, green hydrogen is available, we're just going to throw this away, they're not going to. And not only that, the banks that funded this, they're not going to want to see a loss on that investment either. So there's going to be a lot of pressure to keep this going. So any talk about let's do this for 10 years wouldn't happen. There would be enormous industry pressure to keep going with that. And as we've seen, that's it's no better than what we're doing right now. So you're basically just saying we're not going to solve the problem at all for as long as this new infrastructure is in operation. And then the third reason I would be opposed to blue hydrogen is the closer we get to climate tipping points, the more dangerous methane becomes, because methane operates over shorter timescales. And so as you get closer to that cliff edge, methane is the thing that can push you over. And so this is the worst possible time to start building up more natural gas usage, because you're doing that at the most dangerous time when you are close to triggering some of these irreversible processes. And so the very last thing we need to be doing is investing in any increased natural gas extraction. So that would be my argument against using blue hydrogen. And I think it's obviously also from the first point, it's a huge environmental justice issue. And there was a group called Food and Water Watch that put on a webinar just a couple of days ago that does an extremely good job of explaining this. And I would encourage everybody to watch that to see just how bad it could get if industry does have their way with this blue hydrogen as a transition option. And there's a lot of reason to be concerned about this, not just because industry is pushing for it, but because the infrastructure bill calls for hydrogen investment, and that's not a lot. It's, this is really just research at this point. They're investing 10 times as much in things like EVs and resilience, but they are putting some money towards hydrogen, and they're putting it towards all forms. They're testing nuclear-based hydrogen, they're testing gray hydrogen, blue hydrogen, and green hydrogen, because they want to get, they want to do their own studies for the emissions. But that does mean that right now, because the infrastructure bill, if that part gets passed, then there will be blue hydrogen test projects that start up. So this is something that really could happen, and possibly on a pretty short time scale. So that is everything, and looks like I was able to get through with a little bit of time left. So